it to a particular project or visualize how things could go in a project. And, because see, it's not theoretical as such. It's a lot of it is actually the things that you will do in your project, like your planning or your requirement elicitation techniques that you would be using, right? You have to start visualizing and for a particular project, pick up some project. You can think about it. Anything which you think is of relevance to you, and we can when we are discussing about the documentation techniques as well, we'll use the same case studies, right? So we'll work on some assignments and all. So I would request you to start focusing on those lines, right? So while I'm discussing that mobile banking app, if you feel that there is something else which is of interest to you, start thinking about those requirements. What kind of questions should I ask for each requirement? And then, if you have to go for an interview session, what kind of questions I would document. Right? So prepare on those lines. And then when we actually talk about the use cases and all, we'll see how to document those requirements and such. All right, so let's continue with the session. So we have one more topic, which is the interface specification. Right? Now, this is a joint activity. You're not expected to know to capture all the details about an interface specification.
Yeah. So, sorry to interrupt, but weren't we discussing elicitation methods in last session? So, was that it? Like, reverse engineering and requirement workshops, that was it?
Right. Yeah, I thought we discussed that, and I even gave some overview about the service questionnaires. Yeah. Right? Now, so that's basically the ways in which you can engage the customers. Right? So I think we broadly have an understanding about how to conduct a workshop or reverse engineering session and all. Right? Now, how to document the requirement, we'll learn it later. Right? So, but you can engage the customer in any one of these ways to understand the requirement. So the only thing what I feel is pending is the interface analysis. Right? If you have any questions on any of the other topics, do let me know. I can clarify that.
Okay.
But my understanding was we did cover all those topics.
Yeah, we did actually. But I am a bit confused between business process engineering and reverse engineering. Can you explain that once more?
Right. Now, a process reengineering kind of projects, what they do is they try to make an existing process more efficient. Okay, so basically, if you have to improve something, you first have to understand how it currently works, right? So that part of it, which you want to document the current process, is called as an as-is process. Okay, so this part of it could be understood by doing a reverse engineering, which means you already have a system in place or a process in place, and you're trying to understand how it works, right? So to understand the current system, we could use a reverse engineering technique. And after we understand that and capture that view of as is, then we would also list down, what are all the inefficiencies in this, what can we improve further. So you'll do that analysis and come up with a to-be view of how the future state system should look like. Okay, so this overall process of capturing this current view, then identifying the pain points, and then coming up with the future state, all that would be part of your business process reengineering. Okay, so the BPR kind of process. Now, one way in which we are understanding the current state, that part is called as a reverse engineering.
So you mean to say like reverse engineering is a part of business process reengineering?
Yes. Yes, the first part of it, we generally tend to do it using a reverse engineering.
Okay.
Reverse engineering, it's not just in BPR, but most of the BPR cases we use a reverse engineering technique to understand the current state, right? Mm-hmm. But it also works where there are some existing systems and you want to replace it, right? Mm-hmm. So purely maybe you have a mainframe system and you want to implement a Java-based system, right? So you don't have to engage with the customer in an interview technique and all right from the scratch. Right? So you don't have to understand the requirement from scratch.
So you
All you
mean
could do
to
is,
say like reverse engineering and requirement workshops like JRDs and JAR sessions, they are part of business process engineering.
reverse engineering is workshops. Uh, See again, all these techniques could be relevant in a BPR kind of scenario as well, right? But what I meant to say between the BPR and then the reverse engineering is definite component in your BPR processes, right? Uh, So all these techniques could be used for a normal project as well. Okay, or if you can actually help me out, where exactly is your confusion? Maybe I can use that.
Actually, I was
So
like, when we were talking about it in last session, you were explaining reverse engineering as a part of business process engineering. Then you were talking about requirement workshops. So I got confused there. Like, are these both like
no,
reverse engineering
so
and requirement
workshop is
workshops?
a separate technique, right?
Okay,
So your first understanding of reverse engineering being a part of the BPR is right. Right?
okay,
So the first part of as is requirements we understand by using a reverse engineering technique. That's right. Workshop is a completely different technique for capturing the requirements.
okay.
Okay,
So they are
so
not
it's
related as such.
not related, not related.
Okay.
Okay, I hope that clarifies.
Yes, it did.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So let's move on to the next topic, which is interface specifications. Uh, so any system you pick these days, right? So they're not, uh, you know, working in silos, right? So which means, you know, it either takes input from a different system, external system, or it creates some output which is consumed by some other system. So if this is a system that you're developing, right, either the input is coming in or the output is going out from some other system, right? So it's always not a human who is providing these inputs, right? It could be another system which is providing this input. Similarly, the output is also not displayed on the screen, right, or printed onto a report, but also sent to another system um, as a data file. Okay? Now, when we are exchanging this data, so either data coming in or data going out to other systems, how do we capture this requirement? So that is covered as part of your interface specification, right? So basically, this exchange of data between the systems is considered as an interface, right? So between the humans, it's always the UI. There would be a user interface. You would enter it using your keyboard and then view the output using your monitors. So that is not a problem. But when there is exchange of data between systems, it generally happens through some files, right? So you have these documents which are prepared, and then you exchange these documents. Okay, and depending on the requirement, they could be in a real-time mode, which means the exchange of data happens at that same moment, or in a batch mode, which means you'll collate all the data, and maybe at the end of the day you would send that data to another system, or maybe once in a month you will send all the data to another system, right? So there are multiple details about an interface that you need to capture, right? Any system you take would need this exchange of data between system to system, right? Now, how do we capture these details, right? So, what is the role we contribute as a business analyst? And there would be some contribution from the technical team as well. So, all that we will discuss in today's session. Okay. So, ideally, a typical interface specification consists of these, four broad sections. So you'll have an introduction and then say, broadly this is the requirement, this is the process flow, and this is how the exchange of data happens. Right? So you basically say why is this interface required, and give a context to it as part of the introduction. Right? Then you would capture the details about the interface specification, right, from a functional point of view. Right? Now, this is mostly the functional details. Right? So the second section is mostly about the functional details. Right? So you'll explain about the functionality. What are the steps involved in in this interface, right? So if there are like some data is being sent to the other system, and then there is a response coming in, right? And then maybe you'll follow it up with another request, and another response comes in, right? So all this view is captured in your interface description, the functionality. Right? All these interactions you will explain. First the customer sends information to this system. So all those is covered as part of the functionality. I'll take an example as well so that you can understand it. Then each interaction you'll pick up and then say, what is all the data points that you're sending in. Right? So let's say this is one. So in this interaction, 4 messages were exchanged. Right? Now, what is the format of information exchange of one? Right? So what all data are you sending? Right? And what is the type of data? What is the size of data? All that you need to capture. Right? So that is called as the metadata. Right? So what is the data, that the data points? If you are sending in like 10 data points as part of interface message 1, right? So what type of data it is? What is the maximum size of it? Whether it's optional or mandatory? Where is the data coming from? Right? All those details are covered. We call that as a metadata. Right? We also map it to your underlying database. Right? So where is that data coming in from? So is it coming from your database, or the user is inputting it? All those mapping has to be done clearly. Okay. So section 2 basically consists from a functional point of view. What is the functionality served? What are the data points that you are exchanging? Right? Where is the data coming in from? You generally capture that. Then there would be a technical implementation of it, right? Which basically talks about the syntax. So is it a web service? Is it an XML based file? Is it a CSV file? Right? So there are multiple ways in which this interface could be executed depending on the technology, right? So we are not involved in this section 3. Right? So we don't even need to know how a web service works and all. What we will tell is what is the process, or what is the functional view from a exchange of this data. What happens in each of these messages, what data that we have to exchange, right? And the actual mechanism and the protocol would be decided in the next section, which is generally handled by the technical architect, right? If it has to be a web service, what is the format of the web service? If it has to be a XML format, what is the format? How do you interpret it and all that, right? So those formats and protocols, everything could be taken care by the architects, right? So depending on whether it's a batch or real time. Then you would also capture your exception handling. So let's say an order was placed. If some order was not, received by the system, right? Or maybe the network broke down when you're sending this information. So how should you manage that kind of breakdowns, right? Otherwise, you send this information and then you are waiting for response 2 to come in. Now response 2 won't come in unless response 1, message 1 goes to this particular system, right? So there is a disconnect between these two systems, and you need to handle those exceptions. So maybe you'll put in a rule: if you don't get a response within 30 seconds, say that we cannot process the request further and close it there. So something like that. So all those decisions that you'll have to take if something is not responding or something breaks down would be covered as part of your exception handling. So you'll have to capture this as part of your requirement as well. So what should we do if something is not working or something breaks down? Now also have to ask all those questions and capture the details here. So this is how a typical interface would work. right? So let's look at a couple of examples, and then it will give us a lot more clarity rather than just discuss it theoretically. Let's figure out how a typical interface works. Okay. So I think all of us know about this requirement. We all do shopping online, right? Now, when we are doing shopping, right? So we make our payment using credit cards. Okay. Let's say you're doing the shopping on Amazon. Okay. And after you check out from your shopping cart, you make the payment. Right? And let's say you're using a MasterCard or maybe a MX card to let's call it as MX. Now you're sending it to MX to process the payment. Right? So your payment has to be approved. Now Amazon doesn't know whether you're using the right details or not. Right? So Amazon as a website, they cannot say whether your card is genuine or not and your payment should be approved or not. So who has to approve it? It has to be approved by MX. So what Amazon does is the details that you have entered, it will send it to MX. Right? It will send that as an input to MX, saying that what, I have got this request for some $300, and the card, here are the card details. Now please tell me, should I proceed further or not? Okay. Now MX would validate that transaction and then say, please go ahead, or no, cancel this transaction. So that is the response coming in. Right? A simple interface. You're sending an input, you're getting a response. Okay. So the functionality, is it clear? Are we clear with the functionality? What is happening here? All we are doing is we are working as an we are working as a business analyst for a shopping cart application like Amazon. Now that needs some interface. That interface is to MX so that you can validate the payment. So you're sending some details to MX and then it's processing it and getting a response back. Right? So that's the overall context or introduction to the requirement. Right? Now what you have to cover in detail is what is this series of interactions and what kind of information that you are exchanging, what is the metadata about it, what are those exceptions, right? So whatever we have listed down in this slide, which are in red color, is where we generally get involved in, right? So broadly we'll cover the functionality which I just explained. Then you have to capture the metadata for we have to capture the detailed information that you are exchanging and the metadata for each of the the message that is being exchanged. Now in this particular scenario, there are two messages which are exchanged. You are sending an input to MX with all the card details and then the amount which needs to be deducted, and MX is coming back with a response saying that whether the transaction is approved or not, and the reason as well. Right? Now each of this would have an interface format. Right? So the input between Amazon and MX would consist of some details that you'll have to send. Right? So how do you arrive at these details? So you'll sit down with this system solution owner and then figure out, what, I want this transaction to be processed. So what data do you need? So then this MX guy would say, what, I would need all these 10 data points. You'll have to send me that. Right? Then you would ask, which of them, what type of data is this? All of them, are they text, or are there some of those are numbers? Right? So basically figure out what type of data it is. Right? And then say, you could also ask what is the maximum size it could be, because you cannot when you're creating your databases and all, you have to ensure that you have to provide a size to that. Right? So obviously you're checking it to the customer. Now amount, you're saying it cannot be more than 6 and 3 digits, 3 decimal points. Right? 6 is like maybe you're allowing him to do some $1 million transactions, so $1 million worth of transactions. So you're putting it a size of 6, right? So and then currency, what type of currency is it? A text, and what is the maximum size of it? Right? So you are figuring all that out and then capturing the size as well. Okay. Then you also capture whether it's mandatory or optional. Okay. So in this response or in this input message, some of the data could be mandatory, some of them could be optional, and some of them could be conditional as well. Only under these conditions this data would be mandatory, otherwise it would be optional. Right? So you'll have to figure out all that as well. What is mandatory, what is optional. You'll also give a brief description. Right? So all this data that we have just looked at is called as a metadata. Right? So the type, the size, mandatory, optional, and a description is generally considered as a metadata. Right? Now the word metadata means it's data about data. So it's basically the data that describes another data. So we have this data that needs to be exchanged between two systems, and the metadata is basically some more additional details which is describing these data points. Then you would map it to your underlying database. Right? So where is this data coming in from? Like maybe all your card details would have been stored in your system sometime earlier. Right? So just pulling that out and populating this information into your interface file. Some of them is user input. So based on your selection into the card, your amount is calculated. Right? So you're basically entering the amount by selecting the products. Right? So you are also mapping it to your underlying database. But to understand the data mapping, we need to know how a data model works, which we'll cover it later in the session. Later when I talk about requirements documentation techniques. So this part, column G, we'll revisit later. But this is basically what you would cover as part of your interface message. Okay? So the detailed interface and the metadata, you would capture this information. Okay? So there would be a functionality section which will capture about the the overall functionality that you are achieving. Then there would be a section on the the metadata in the interface which will consist of these details.
I have two questions. First is like, what is this conditional and mandatory? I mean, what is the difference between that? Secondly, this data mapping thing is there. We have to talk with our system architecture also, right? Because
you need to understand the underlying data model, right? So we would look at it. How do we cover the data model? How do we understand? So basically, we do that using an ER diagram, right? So entity relationship diagram, as we call. So basically, we should be in a position to understand a data model also, okay? Which will be covered in the course. You don't need to worry about it. We'll learn how to understand the data model and then do this data mapping. So this part I'll cover it later. Okay. So coming over to your first question. Yeah. So coming over to your first question. So see some data. If you pick up any. So if you look at any of those forms, right? So you'll find that some of that data is mandatory. Like email address is mandatory, and this is also mandatory. You're putting in asterisk here. Password is mandatory. Username also should actually have been mandatory, and the security answer. So whatever is mandatory, it's basically the required fields. Without this, you cannot proceed further. Right? So similarly, when you want to send this message, you want to make sure that the amount is there. Right? Then the credit card details is there. Right? Then maybe the name is optional. You don't really need the name. If you have the credit card detail, number and all, the transaction can be approved by Amex. It doesn't need the name of the person and the address also. Right? Maybe you can send it, but it's not mandatory. Right? So some details are mandatory, some details are optional. So all the details which are mandatory, you'll capture that as mandatory, and all the details which can be blank, you call them as optional. Now some details would be conditional. So wherein under some specific conditions that would be relevant. Like let's say if you are an individual, provide your address. like let's provide your SSN number, and if you are a company, provide a company registration number, right? So these informations of SSN and then company registration numbers are conditional. So if the person is individual, then SSN number is mandatory. If the customer is a company, then your company registration number is mandatory, right? So that's more of a conditional kind of data. I hope that gives you some clarity on what conditional is.
Yes. Thank you.
Right. So when you are talking to your customer, so to the SME, right? So first step, you would have to have a clear understanding about this functionality, right? So how many interactions would be required? How many messages needs to be exchanged? What does your input message consist of? What all data that you are transferring, right? So you list down all that data. Then you would list down the metadata as well, right? And then where is this data coming in from? Is it coming in from our database or the user input? If it is coming from the database, you'll have to look at the data model and then pick that data and then link it here, right? How do we do that? I'll cover that later. And if it's user input, you just mention user input. Okay. So the first data that we are sending in, an input, would, we are sending in these details. We're sending in ID, amount, currency, exchange rate, card details, and address. Okay. Then we are also capturing the metadata about it and the data mapping, right? So we covered about introduction, we covered about functionality, we covered about metadata. Data mapping we are skipping for now. Okay. So this is all what we would cover. So once we capture this detail, the technical team would figure out what is the format. So is it a web service? Is it an XML format? So all that they would figure it out. Okay. So let me show you a small example of how XML would look like. Right. Okay. Before we get into that, let me give you a context. Right. So you would also help in deciding whether it should be in a batch or real-time mode. So this a lot of the times it depends upon the business team. If the business says that no, I need this data at that same moment, then you can then you should have a real-time interface. Otherwise, it could be in a batch interface. Why? Because batch interfaces are very simple. It takes lesser effort compared to a real-time interface, and it doesn't create a bottleneck in the process. Right? So you tend to go for batch interfaces wherever possible, and only in the worst case scenarios where you definitely need that particular interface to be covered to process a transaction, you would keep that as real time. For example, in this case, Amazon cannot wait till the end of the day to figure out whether the transaction is approved or not, whether the amount is approved or not, right? So obviously it wants to connect to Amex right at that same moment, and maybe within 1 second, 2 seconds, it should get a response saying that your transaction is completed or your transaction is rejected. Otherwise, there's a good chance that Amazon could lose business. Okay, so the business criticality is that this has to be in a real time. In some cases, it can be it might not be so important. It can happen later in the day as well. So what you do as part of batch interfaces is you would collate all the data which came in for that particular day. Let's say there were 10 requests which came in, and these requests has to be sent to some other team. Okay, so what you will do is you will write all these 10 requests into a particular file in a particular format and then send it out, right? So that process is called as a batch interface. So we'll look at a batch interface later. First, let's focus on real-time interface. So as a first step, we'll give an introduction, then we'll talk about the functionality, the exchange of informations, right? Then the metadata, right? So what data needs to be exchanged and what is where is the data coming in from. So this is where you would contribute. Now the syntax of that particular interface has to be agreed. So there are multiple formats. There could be web services, there could be XML formats, there could be a flat file. Then depending on the the technology which they are using, the architects would decide, right? So you don't really need to worry about the protocol, right? So the most popular ones are the web services and the XML formats. Okay. Yeah, so it's showing a simple example of XML. Now, I'll cover this later. Right. So, XML is nothing but you have these multiple columns, right? So there is a bill pay account validation XML. You have an ID number, then you have biller ID number, then an account number, and a transaction amount number. Right? So these are the four data points that are being exchanged. There is a customer identifier also, which you have to capture, but this is empty. This is optional, so we have kept it as empty. Right? So overall, this is what you're sending in as a message. So this is an XML format. Right? So you don't really need to worry about the technical details and all. Just for your additional information that I'm telling you, that an XML format might look. So there are like some protocols, like there is a REST protocol, right? And then there is a SMOOC protocol, and then there is a web service in Java, right? So there are some examples which will there are some different types of protocols, and you are not anyway going to decide it, right? So you won't really care about it. So it's basically some program which will be written, and then the data in that would be all the metadata that you have agreed upon would be going in as part of that program to another application, another system, right? So that's basically is a web service format. Then you have these XML formats. So XML, like I've shown, it will have a structure to a particular file. So that also would be exchanged. Okay. Then where you would contribute is the exception handling. Now, between these interactions, okay, there is a good chance that the system could be down, the internet could be down, and maybe there could be a power cut also when you are somewhere in between the transaction. Okay, so how should you handle these requests? How to handle these exceptions? Exceptions are some breakdown scenarios, right? So what if something goes wrong? How should you handle this, right? So let's say the internet is down when you are sending an input message. So obviously, if the internet it goes down, right? So your input will not even be received by MX. So it won't be processed. You won't get a response, right? So this system keeps on waiting. So you'll have to clearly specify, how much time you should wait. So maybe 20 seconds is the max, or 30 seconds. So wait for 30 seconds, and if there is no response, display a message saying that the network is down, please try again later. Okay. Then let's say this system is down. SAMX system is down. So you now it cannot take any input. So you have sent in an input and you are waiting for an output, which will never come because the system is down, right? So maybe you'll have to wait for another 30 seconds and then display a message saying that your MX network is down, please try again or later. There could be a scenario wherein you send an input, MX processes it, and then it's sending a response. But before you get the response, there is a power cut, or maybe the internet is down. So that could be a possible scenario, right? So MX could have processed the transaction, it could have deducted money from his account, but you won't get that confirmation because the network was down. So what you as Amazon would think is that this transaction has not been processed, it's not even gone to MX, right? But MX got the data and then it has actually confirmed the payment, right? Now what should it do? Right? So there is a disconnect, right? If I am a customer of Amazon and I have placed an order for, let's say, $200, so Amazon would think that no transaction happened, and Amex would have deducted $200 from my account. Okay, so obviously this needs to be handled by somebody. So how are you going to handle it? So I'm saying that, manually at the end of the day, create a file with all those failed transactions and then reconcile it with Amex as a separate offline process, right? So that from a business point of view, you have to clearly understand from the business team. So in these situations, what should we do? And then capture the requirement. So that is all what you will do as an interface, right? So you might think it's a little complicated, it's technical and all, but as a business analyst, we stick to the areas where we are good at, right? So we are not good at the syntax, the protocols and all. This is best handled by the technical architect. Okay, we are expected to capture the functionality and then capture the details, which we are doing. Whatever is indicated in red is where you would contribute. Whatever is in black, you would leave it for the architect to fill it. So the protocols and the creation of those exchange, the interface formats and all, you would leave it to the technical team, technical architect. Okay. So there are a few more topics about interfaces that I have to explain. But I just wanted to make sure that this scenario you have understood. Okay, so we created interface for one part. Now then there is a response coming in, right? So response, you would sit down with Amex and then figure out, what, you send me these three details. You send me transaction ID, whether it's approved or not, and a reason of why it's approved or rejected, right? So you'll capture the metadata also for that, incoming message, right? So this input is an outgoing message to Amex, and then response is an incoming message from Amex to Amazon, right? So this is basically what you do in an interface. Okay. Now we looked at a real-time interface. We still have to cover a batch interface, and there's something called as a APIs, right? So that's another type of interface we generally involve in. I'll cover that as well.
Just in case if the interviewer asks, from where the data was coming, so what should we say?
In the sense where can you
like in our project, we must be taking data from somewhere. So if he asks, what we should say,
So broadly, the data would come in from two sources. It has to come in from your database, or the user has to enter it, right? So let's say, if you pick up a Amazon website, right? Then you have your shopping cart. Sorry. So you have a shopping cart, and then you add in something to that, and then when you're sending it, some information would have been. Let's put in some. Right. I'll just add this. Okay. So I'm picking up this product. Okay, and then I proceed to checkout. Okay, now it's basically showing you the address as well, and then deliver to this address. I'm just giving you some details. Right, now this address and all was already inputted by me. Okay, so that's covered in the database. So that's stored somewhere in the database. Now we'll have to point where exactly it was stored. Right, so the address has to be has been stored. The card details also have been stored. Okay, now the card details also would be displayed, and then they would, but the amount has been inputted by me, so it was not stored in the database anyway. Okay, so this process would continue. You would anyway. Let's stop there. But I think you got a hang of it, right? So basically, we are, some information is stored in the database, some information is coming in as an input, which the user enters as part of the functionality, right? Like in this case, amount is calculated by the products that you select. Okay, but the credit card information I have already uh, inputted into the Amazon website. So this information is already there in the system, right? But what we need to figure out is where exactly is it coming from? Where in the database is it stored, right? So it's stored in a table called as card, and then the credit card number is an attribute in which the credit card number. So you need to understand how data model is structured, how the database is structured. So that's the reason I have kept this part of it on hold. I'll cover it later once we understand databases. Okay. I hope your question is clarified, or is it still not? So all you have to do is you have to sit with this guy, the business analyst or the solution owner from the other system guy, and then agree upon what data points you need, what is the metadata about each, whether you store it in your database or it's coming as a user input, right? If you are sending the input, you will figure out. If you are getting a response, then this guy would figure out, right? So he will define this mapping. You get it?
Yeah, it's clarified now. Thank you.
Okay.
Yes, I had a question. I was like just a bit confused between like we would be at the client side, right? So like we have to understand both the databases for all this. Like
Not really. There would be a person from the other side as well.
Yeah, as well as other side.
Right. So there would be a solution owner or a business analyst. So usually, the person who understands the other system would be there. So you would sit together with that person and then figure out, what, to perform this functionality, you would need to exchange this data, right? So and then this is the metadata about it. So you will agree on to that. So that would be part of your discussions.
Okay. And
so you're not going to decide it on your own. Yeah.
Right. That would be a part of our discussion after discussing with the SMEs from the client side, and then we have to also check at the vendor side that our database is also matching with their database because it is input and
not vendor side. It would be an external system,
external.
right? Or maybe some other system in your organization also.
Right.
But it's a different system.
Yeah, so both has to get synchronized, right? I mean, there should be some mapping between both the systems for getting this.
So let me summarize this. First step, you'll understand the requirement, right? So you know that this data has to be captured or sent to this to this guy, or from a functional point of view, you'll figure out, what, I need to get this payment approved. Right? So then you would sit with this MX guy and then figure out, what kind of data do you need to approve a transaction? Then this guy would say, what, you need to provide me the card details, the amount, the currency, and also give me a transaction ID. Okay. Then you'll go back and then figure out, okay, where do I get the card information from? I have already stored it, so I'll have to pick it up from the database. Where do I get the amount? I would get it from, let's say, the screen which is calculating the checkout screen. Right? So it's an input coming in. So for each of these data points that you have agreed with this guy, you'll figure out this metadata as well. Right? So that both of them are consistent. It should not be that one guy has considered this card number as a number, the other guy considered it as a text. Right. So that inconsistency should not be there. So both the parties will stick to the same size, formats, and then mandatory and optional. So that there are no validation errors later, data integrity errors.
Yeah, because why I asked this question was because there won't be only one client using the same thing, because we would be prototyping this thing for multiple this. So for that reason, the types has to be synchronized for all the same fashion.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's clear.
So next session, what we'll look at is we'll look at a batch interface also, and something called as an APIs, because you'll keep hearing this term API a lot of places now, right? So people are moving away from this point-to-point integrations and then publishing APIs, right? So you should be clear about how to capture the requirements and how to go about it in the API. Okay. So we'll look at it. We'll take some examples as well, and then we'll get it here. So first part of it, where we have a real-time interface where we send input and get a response, we clearly know what we need to do now. Okay. So next session, I will talk about the rest of the